It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Kenyon from St. Thomas University in New Brunswick, Fredericton. And we're really honored to have Gary here because Gary's a foundational. Not only he started the Department of Gerontology at St. Thomas University, but he's been working in the area of narrative for a very large part of his life. He graduated from UBC with an interdisciplinary PhD and then went to USC for a year to work with somebody. His name is James Buren, and those of you that are interested in guided autobiography and life review, we've had the honor of knowing James. He influenced me a lot, and so, as you know, we here in counseling psychology use life review and a guided autobiography approach in group work, and particularly in the work that we're doing with returning soldiers from Afghanistan. Many people in a therapeutic sense don't feel comfortable just talking, but we all have stories. And the narrative is the perfect way to start a story and keep the expert in it. So Gary, I want to welcome you. You'll talk about the center. It's great to be back in Vancouver for a while.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, we're aging successfully. I think we're supposed to. So welcome. It's over to you. Okay.
Thank you. Mark, it is great to be. Nice to be back in Vancouver. I'm getting the flu still, so my voice is off and on, but I think it'll hold up. Yeah, nice to be back in Vancouver and UBC. I had a good experience doing my doctorate here, and with Shel Rubinson, and was interdisciplinary with Shel Rubinson in adult education, and Michael Chandler in the psych department, and I think it's Winkler in the philosophy department. He had a lesser role to play, so I don't remember his name as well. But, and then Jim Thornton, who was kind of the coordinator of the program. As Mark said, I spent a year after I left here at USC at the Andrew Norman Institute for Gerontology and Geriatrics. And just after I say this quick story, I just thought I'd go around the room and you could say your name, so we would all kind of make that connection in a short way. But when I went to USC, I didn't say much of anything for the first couple of months because I was around the table in this weekly seminar with all the people's books I had just studied from, Warner Shai and several other people, and so I didn't think I had anything to say because I just finished my PhD. So Jim Buren called me aside and said, "You should talk." He said, "I brought you down here because you finished your work and it's interesting, so you need to talk." So I broke the ice with it, and then everything was fine after that. But it was I thought it would be a tough crowd at first. So yeah, maybe just before we start the actual content, if we could just say who you are, and does everybody know everybody here, or just say what department you're in, or maybe what degree you're doing, or what you're doing right now?
So I'm Yari, and I just finished my PhD in December in counseling psychology.
Great.
And I'm Sandra Wiens, and I'm hoping to finish my PhD in counseling psychology this year, and I'm very interested in this workshop. I'm doing a narrative study myself, and it's around the experiences of families that have a member that has serious mental illness.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Nana Espinosa, and I'm in my second year of the Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology.
My name is Shala. I'm in the first year of counseling psych. I'm in the early stage of putting together my thesis on international students and their dealing with loss and grief.
Hi, my name is Linda. This is my second year of my master's degree here in LAUP.
Thank you.
My name is Dawn, and I'm doing my M.Ed in adult education and learning, and I'm currently taking the autobiography course with Jim Buren's group.
Okay, great.
I'm Mariana Terra, and I'm defending my doctoral dissertation tomorrow morning at Huck, and it's to do with older adults' experiences of living badly.
And you're part of the reason I'm here.
You very kindly came.
And she's engaged in self-regulation now?
With what?
She's engaged in self-regulation.
Self-regulation.
Which is very common.
Right.
I'm Ishu Shen. I'm the area coordinator for counseling psychology master's and PhD programs. I'm interested in multicultural, cross-cultural counseling issues. Very much interested in the work, so I'm happy to be here.
Thank you.
Over to me. I'm Garnet Grosjean. I'm a faculty member in Ed Studies. And many years ago, Shel Rubenson was also my advisor. I'm in the adult education department. And I just finished having coffee with Jim.
Oh,
So we share, some colleagues.
Yeah.
I'm Nomi Denson. I'm not a student. I'm currently working. I'm a music therapist, and I run a writers group at a senior long-term care facility. I've been running it for 6 years. So we thought this would be a fabulous course for me to take.
I'm Cheryl. I'm starting the Department of Gerontology at SFU after a completely different background. So I have an anthropology with no background, so it'll be interesting.
What are you doing there?
A post-bac in
gerontology.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'm Allison, and I'm completing my minor actually in gerontology at SFU.
I'm Ross. I'm in my second year of the master's program in counseling psychology, and I've been doing a lot of work with the Veterans Transition Program with Mark Westwood, and part of my interest in this today is I'm also interested in doing some of the life review stuff. So this workshop naturally is really interesting for me, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you.
I'm Stu. I'm in the first year of the PhD in counseling psych. I'm a supervisor. I've done life review working groups, and part of my research interest is around narratives in groups. So I'm quite interested in learning more about that.
Great.
I'm Salome, and I'm in the second year of the MA program, and my research focus is mindfulness, self-care, and group.
Okay, great.
I'm Lucy, and I'm in my third year of the PhD.
Hi, thank you. I'm Catherine Clayback. I may have emailed most of you. I'm in the MA program, second year, and my research is in mindfulness and gratitude.
Great. Well, I already told you a bit about my background. I guess if there are any questions that come up as we go along, and feel free to interrupt me anytime if I'm running out of time with what I would like to cover with you. I'll just say let's do that later or something. But this material can go in many different directions, and so if something comes up that's really pressing for you, maybe I can talk more about it. Basically, here's my technology skills here.
Side arrow.
Oh, I'm turning it the wrong way. See, I'm really with it here.
There we go. Yay.
When it comes to this stuff, we say in gerontology that's a cohort phenomenon. I'm learning as I go along. I have the iPhone, I have the laptop. Now I just have to figure out how all it works. Not some of it. So, what I'm going to talk about today is quite a broad overview of what we call narrative gerontology. And without being boastful, but just accurate, narrative gerontology really started at St. Thomas University with Bill Randall, my colleague Bill Randall and myself, and a Finnish colleague who passed away a number of years ago, Jan-Erik Ruth. So we have, the reason I have this book in my hand is, this is the latest one that has come out about narrative gerontology. And there are several other volumes that go back really since 1991. One called Metaphors of Aging, which actually had an original sort of kick at the can at UBC here when I was a graduate student. But the book didn't get published till afterwards. And then another book called Narrative Gerontology, another one called Aging and Biography. I think it's the Narrative Gerontology one that Marv has a chapter in with David Poole. So this is a further development of this approach. We don't really even call it a field. It's more of a way of looking at things, changes across the lifespan from a life story point of view. So I would direct you probably to this, because if you start reading through some of the chapters in this book, you'll get the bibliography to the earlier books on a whole range of topics. We teach a whole course called Narrative Gerontology, and another course Bill Randall teaches called Counseling Older Adults. So we use a lot of this material, and then there's other stuff that comes from other disciplines and other scholars that we don't use ourselves quite as much. But we asked everybody who was writing chapters for the book to kind of develop some new ideas from what they've done before, because some of them have done chapters before and some are new.
So Gary, could I just comment on that?
Just so you know, this book, UBC Library is purchasing this book, and we'll give you the reference for it at the end. Okay?
Yeah. So some things that I talk about today will be approaches, interventions, ideas that are closer to my own interests, and others you can find in the book, but I don't know as much about those things. It's a very wide-ranging field. It's loosely organized, too, on purpose. We those who are drawn to narrative gerontology all have a passion for stories, all have a passion for lifespan development. I wouldn't even say purely older adults, but most of it is about older adults, but not necessarily. We try to get away from, Marv and I were just talking in the car about the term gerontology, and it always seemed to talk about old people. Whereas really what many of us are interested in are changes across the lifespan, and stories will reflect that, and I hope some of the ideas I show you here will convince you that that's the way we are as human beings. It has very little to do with chronological age, a lot of the important stuff anyway. So theory and practice, I'm going to show some, the book's kind of divided up into theory, research, and practice, and I'm going to just pick certain things, some theoretical concepts. I know as students, Marv and I were just talking about that in the car too, that one of the contributions we hope we've made here is that graduate students can label what they do. Some years ago it was difficult to say I'm doing something with life stories, and they say, what's that, or how does that do anything, or what does it mean? And more recently, both Bill and I have had more invitations by faculty members saying, my student wants to do this and we don't quite know what to do with it, so would you be on our committee, on the person's committee? And it's worked out quite well in several different universities in Canada, and I believe he's done a couple in the States too. So at one level, it's a label to put on respectable academic work. At another level, it's very, it's about our own lives as well as personally, as well as our professional work with other people. So there are a number of different agendas going on here. For those of us, I think I can speak for anybody who's in that book anyway, that's kind of how we see, so the sort of academic world that tries to separate itself out from things, there's less of a stark or a determined distinction there. And also I think in one of the things Bill and I have written, we talk about humanizing the sciences. That is bringing sort of real people into the theories and the research design and the practice models that we use. So that's kind of an intuitive thing that underlies what narrative gerontology, why we're passionate about narrative gerontology. And you can feel free, of course, to disagree with anything I say. And like I tell my students, you don't just say, that's stupid. You have to argue why you don't agree with it. But if you do, feel free
To argue.
to do that, to argue, yeah. Now, oh, sorry, I shouldn't have done that yet. We're going to start with the most profound and esoteric aspect of narrative gerontology. This is, may as well get that stuff out of the way right away. So what I want you to do, I have 3 concepts I'm going to put up here one at a time, and I want you to see whether you can think of a story, a short story that relates to this particular concept. So the first one is that. Any takers? This is just...
Oh, in this group there'll be takers.
Anybody want to tell a short story? They have to be short.
It's about an apple.
About an apple.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I'm sitting in front of my computer and my son's coming along and he's saying, Mom, you should know how to figure that out. And it's an Apple computer. And it's a young son, right?
Yeah. Well, they're the experts, right? Any other Apple stories?
Well, as soon as you said that, I retrieved a memory that I actually haven't thought of for probably 4 decades or longer, and that was, I grew up on a farm, and I had a favorite cousin that used to spend every summer with us, and we would go back to the back of the farm just roaming around, and there was one apple tree back there that I just loved, and it had, it was wild, and it had these special apples that tasted so different from any apples we could ever get at the store. And we bit into them. The flesh was actually quite pink rather than white, and it was so magical doing that every summer, going back and finding this old tree and getting those apples.
Thank you. Yeah.
I was brought up in Japan, and in those days, like in the 1950s, in Japan we didn't have apple juice. Like unless you're really wealthy, you had access to imported apple juice. As a child, I occasionally had run high fever, and one day I said to my mother, I want apple juice. And she didn't know when to get it, so she would go and buy a couple of apples, and then she would grate by hand and squeeze it. That's what I remember.
Maybe one more, if there's another one, because it's not a...
I used to go visit a friend in the 70s who was a dancer in Big Apple.
Big apple.
Big Apple in New York. So that has a special apple direction.
That's like what you thought of. Yeah. Okay, so that's really good. This first difficult concept. The second one is...
When the late 60s, I was 16, and my boyfriend, who is my husband now, had an old Norton motorbike that he had restored, and he thought that I would have no problem riding it, like operating it. And so I said, sure, I'll try it. Though I've never done stick shift or clutch or anything in my life, right? I wasn't even driving at that point. And so I got on the bike, and he said, just do something, and I did it, and it just took off like this, and I went, oh my God, took my hands off, bike spun around with me, and then I just flew off, and it was kind of exhilarating. I did live.
You're okay.
Yeah.
Any other bike stories?
Yeah, first thing that flashed into my mind was learning how to ride a bike, and my dad always saying, you don't need training wheels. And so whenever I take a bike, I think of that, like, the whole thing, this big loopy handle at the back of this bike and running along behind me. I say, no training wheels.
Great. One more. Yeah.
We had just come to Canada, and we were staying at my aunt's place in Vancouver, and she had 2 cats, and I was just playing with one of them, and it was sitting on my lap, and my cousin turned on the vacuum in the other room, and the cat freaked out and just dug its claws into my legs. But I have these cool scars on my legs now, but I still love them.
put it outside on the patio. The cats came and ate it. We were having a family over that night called the Katses. I was 6. I went to the front door. I said, "Why did you eat all our chicken?" Oh, we were friends for life after that.
The idea of this little exercise is, well, it does a number of things, but the first main thing it does is, as soon as you see the word, I bet you a lot of you, if not everybody, thought of it, something. And some of you shared the story right away, and some didn't, but it makes you think of stories. And then you probably noticed when one person told the story that it made you think of a story. This can get into more detail, by the way. This is an overview of this particular exercise, but you can also start to see, first of all, that we're full of stories. And so I'm going to talk about that in a minute as one of the basic assumptions of this thing called narrative gerontology. Other things that you might notice there are the story that came up was about a whole other time of life. You know, a long time ago, maybe not, or a story of different culture experiences. And another thing I always notice listening to these stories is I can usually picture myself. I can just about picture myself there with the person telling the story. So they're very alive, no matter when they happen. So I use this pretty well all the time. I mentioned that the one agenda for this workshop is for you to possibly have some tools or things you can use in your own things that you do now or in the future. And I find this, and so does Bill, we both find this very effective in sensitizing groups to this whole story thing. You know, it's not invasive, it's quite straightforward, and people can usually think of stories right away, and also kind of warms up the atmosphere if you're going to go on to talk about more sort of academic stuff and that sort. Not that that's not interesting, but you know, you try to have a balance. Yeah.
I was going to say, one thing I'm noticing is even as we were doing this activity that maybe the group's warmed up, but actually I'm getting a sense of trust that's building.
Yeah, okay.
Just from this,
yeah.
What you might
Yeah.
a simple but not so simple.
Yeah, and I think for me that's one of the things about this, the idea of story, or the metaphor of life as a story, on one level, it's been around forever, it's quite intuitive, you know, the story of my life and so on and so forth, but very quickly it can get quite subtle as well, and I hope, you know, I think most of you probably already have some experience with this, but I hope to add a couple of things to your repertoire and learn some things from you, but it goes quite, it can get quite subtle as well as being pretty simple in a positive way at another level. Oh yeah, before I forget, there's another dimension of this that I'm quite interested in myself that I've been working on, and I'd like to share that with you. So if you don't want to do it, you don't have to, but if you want to just stand up beside your chair, we're going to do a breathing exercise. Okay, I won't give it away. Just wait. So what we're going to do is you just stand with your feet about shoulder width, your knees released, so don't lock your knee joints, and with your palms turned out. And all we're going to do is try and relax your arms and shoulders. So this is a little Tai Chi breathing exercise. I'll explain why I'm doing it later. You always try and keep your joints open so your elbows are relaxed, your shoulders are relaxed. And then all you're going to do is take a nice breath in as you come up, palms up. Turn over and just float back down as you breathe out. Just working with your own breath, your own speed of letting your breath out. Yeah, in. Do it a couple more times. In, breathing in, come up. once more. So night breath as you come up, and then release and float down. Relax everything. Now, thank you. My classes, I always do this in my classes. I school them. I always make a joke. I say, I can't force you to do it. You can go for a smoke or you can do it. Well, you have to keep students entertained these days. Right? Not you folks, undergraduate students. Okay, so now what we're going to do is look at this metaphor of life as a story for a bit. And I'm just going to keep a rough eye on the time because I want to make sure we have time for two major pieces of this. So we call it the stories we are. And there are some basic concepts, again, that pretty well everyone seems to agree with, that is attracted to this idea of narrative gerontology, or this lens. We kind of call it a lens of looking at our lives throughout the lifespan. These two terms refer to the idea, facticity and possibility. The idea behind this is that there really are no facts in a story. Whether it's a life story, I would say whether it's a scientific theory, it doesn't matter what the story is. And some of this gets sensitive for some people because I would say the Bible or the Quran, Buddhist treatises, Buddhist sutras, they're all stories. Some are written a long time ago, some are written more recently, but they're all stories. Most historians now don't look at events that took place at such and such a time. They try to tell a story about what happened back in such and such a time because they can't claim it to be a real set of facts most of the time. Not that it's totally subjective or doesn't have any knowledge content in it, but not in the traditional sense of absolute truth or objectivity in the narrow sense of the term. So facticity, I won't get too far off on this because I have a real interest in philosophy of science. So, facticity refers to the idea that our stories are something. They're made up of something that has some sort of knowledge content in it, an event, something did take place, say, earlier in our life, but they're not quite objective truths. That's the idea here. They're sort of half, Bill Randall calls them faction, part fact and part fiction. So this is the idea of we're kind of unpacking this life as story metaphor. How does it work? And the other term, possibility, refers to the idea that because they're not totally facts, they're open to possibility. These experiences or events or things that took place in the past are open to new interpretations, shall we say. And we're going to look a bit more at that when we go through this short list of things. So that's one of the basic concepts of how these stories are. Another important thing about the stories we are is that, I call it anyway, I think there's some agreement with this idea, it's an ontological metaphor. That is, stories are not just something we tell or something that's kind of cool to have, that we all have a life story, but we would say it's stronger than that we are those stories. So in thoughts, cognitively, emotionally, and also in terms of volition, in predispositions to act. So in other words, we really to a large extent run our lives by way of the stories that we happen to believe in at a certain time. Now right away I have to say that doesn't mean you can trade your story in immediately and get a better one. Like sort of the stereotypical California syndrome. Hey man, I don't like my story, I'll buy a new one or I'll find a PhD, give me a new story or whatever it happens to be. It's more complicated than that, or more existential than that. But still, the stories are not just ideas or words they're emotionally charged ideas or words, and they predispose us to act in a particular way. Okay? If I'm going too fast, just let me know, because I'm going to give an overview of these are sort of the core ideas in this perspective. Oh yeah, I just have to show you one other thing. I'll go back. This is facticity. So the idea being that perhaps the stories that we're mostly talking about the stories we don't like, right? That's an interesting thing. You think about a lot of the work we do, and even perhaps with our own lives, when things are going great, we don't need to do much with those stories, right? I'll take more of that, please. But it's when the challenges come up, or the losses, or disillusionment, the sort of more nasty things about life that come up. Those are the stories that we may want to do something with, for ourselves or others that we're working with professionally, or families, or friends even. But the idea of facticity and possibility is that perhaps a lot of times we've locked ourselves up in a particular story, and maybe it's we who can unlock it. Not necessarily only alone, but in some way or another. Now let me go back here. Another very important aspect of narrative gerontology has to do with time. So we talk about at least two different kinds of time: clock time and story time. Clock time is pretty obvious. It's the calendar, chronological time. And we do all have to have some connection, as my German colleague and friend Willy Mader says. He was actually here for a year on sabbatical, close to the time that I was here, and we've become really good friends since then. And so he would say, he's retired now, but he was an adult education professor and psychoanalyst, and he would say we all have to have a relationship to clock time. We do have to have a story about clock time. Perhaps very soon you won't get OAS till you're 67. Harper has his way, right? Well, that's a slam dunk. That's going to happen. As a gerontologist, I can tell you that's going to happen. But so we do have to deal with clock time. Some aspects of our lives are graded, as a sociologist would say, are graded, age graded, right? But more importantly, I think from a narrative point of view, is story time, is the way that we see our lives. And if you talk to people, the more and more you talk to people, the more the way they live time is not mostly by clock time. And this has come up in a variety of ways in a lot of narrative research and practitioners, people who work from a narrative point of view. And there's some of this in Mariana's dissertation, which was another example for me. I'm always looking for these examples, and I said, there it is again. So, so the idea is that I'm going to give you a few examples of how this works. If you try and find out who's old, it's extremely difficult. The old is always somebody else if you talk to people. I've had a nun near my place told me once she was 85 and she was caring for the older nuns in her community. So it really doesn't, not connecting to, the old is always somebody else. Personally, I think when we feel old has to do with frailty and becoming ill rather than any chronological point that we might get to, for most people. Another example is narrative research that asks people, just tell me your story. And people say, well, where do you want me to begin? And you say, anywhere you want. And some will say at the beginning, and some will say when I lost my spouse, or some will say when my oldest child left home. There's some other feature or theme in their story that's most meaningful to them, besides being chronologically any particular way along this journey of life. So that's another example of how people don't connect to chronological time. The oldest old, there's some really interesting research that's coming out very recently about people in their late 80s and 90s, 100, and they seem to, at least from what the researchers say, that many old people live in a kind of a present moment. Not that they don't have a future time perspective still, but they seem to live very strongly in the present. That has a lot of very suggestive interests from a kind of spiritual point of view. You know, what are we as human beings? Where are we going? What's going on there? Because these people don't make that up. It's pretty hard to make that up and stick with it, right? It's something that happens to them. So those are just a few examples. And the other thing about time is that the story, whether it's a past story or a future story, the part of our lives that we're thinking about or writing about, has to do with, just lost my place here. Yes, it happens in the present. So even though the meaning of the story takes place in the present, so it could be a past story or a future story, but the meaning is now, and that is what we can re-story. I'm going to introduce that term in a minute, but we can use our sense of possibility to change the story because, yes, it's something that happened perhaps in the past, but that's not where we are living it. We're living it now. So the present moment becomes very important. Some of you mentioned mindfulness, and that's part of what interests me in this whole thing. I'll tell you, that's why I got you to do the breathing. I might get you to do it one more time, because I have some things to say about that part of it that really interests me too. Okay, then another concept we use a lot is the larger story we live within, which just means that we, from a narrative point of view, no two people are exactly alike. If you look closely enough, our stories are unique. And I would say we create the meaning of our stories from our inner sense of ourself, our inner self, or inner aging, we use that word too. But we do live in a larger world, and we're part of a lot of other stories, like a gender story, cultural story, professional story, religious story perhaps. And you can't, that's part of who we are. We're not sort of self-enclosed individuals, right? We're social and interpersonal creatures. So we do find meaning or don't find meaning in these larger stories that go to make up our inner story. But it's the inside story that puts it together, out of which the meaning of our own lives comes from. And I make a point of that because there are some strong views in psychology and sociology that sort of don't talk a lot about the inner life of human beings. And I've always thought there was something missing there. Again, without going into too much detail about that. Who was it that, I think it was Jim Beeran who said it's very odd that B.F. Skinner had a life story, published a life story. You know? So okay. And this term just refers to the idea that because we are part of a larger story, we don't create our life stories in a vacuum, but we create it by co-authoring it, writing it together with all of those around us and a physical environment and all those other factors that come into play. Okay, I've already mentioned a little bit about the inside of aging, which is where the meaning of the story comes from, and that is kind of a timeless place in a sense. As I say, we live time in many different ways. There are other ways besides the ones I mentioned there. Like anybody who does meditation, for example, there's a different experience of time in that sort of experience. Or if you're just fell in love, you know how the minutes go by like hours. Or if you're just at the doctor's office, and then the minutes go by like hours, but in a different way. So there are a lot of different forms of time that we live. My colleague at Langara, Jeff Webster, has actually been doing some research on this lately, and I don't know exactly what it's about. I just saw that he was doing it. And he's going to be visiting for a semester at our university in the fall, and he's going to teach a course called Time, Identity, and Wisdom, which I think I'll have to sit in on a little bit. It sounds fascinating. Okay, and then the restorying, which is a term that Bill Randall and I came up with in a book we wrote called Restorying Our Lives. As you'll see, this is not reinventing the universe. Some of these ideas have been around and are used, but we kind of labeled them, tried to interpret them or explain them in a way that would be useful for gerontology and for others working in this area. So there are 3 steps in what we call changing the restorying process, which is basically how do we go about finding a new story or changing the story that we are currently living. Storytelling. So the first thing, which will come as no surprise in this room, but the first thing you need to do is be willing to tell your story, right? Whether it's, I mean, I like the classic example of that is the 12-step program or for addicts. That first thing you have to do is say, my name is so-and-so and I'm an addict. And that, I think, is an example of how this, that's the necessary, the sine qua non of anything that's possible to change in your own story or to help someone else change their story. If they're not willing, you can't do it. In the case of addiction, I have examples in my own family that I've learned very acutely about how that works and how that, not myself, so far anyway. But I'm getting too old to drink too much anyway now. Although you know some people my age. I'm off on a tangent. Those personal experiences as well as professional stuff has really shown me how right addiction counselors are when they say you cannot make somebody do anything. They'll live or they'll die, but it's because they decide to do that. So you can't force storytelling and restorying on anyone. And I don't know why a couple of people have written about this. What is it that triggers somebody to get to what we call the storying moment? The moment when they start to become aware of their life as a story, and in these cases want to change it. You know, I don't like this anymore. I need to do something different, and I'm willing to talk about it, either professional or friends or whatever it happens to be, whatever the story happens to be. So that's a real mystery, I think. You know, depending on your spiritual background or your psychological interests. You know, a Buddhist would say it's your karma, and the time's come for you to do that. Somebody else might say, well, the universe just popped it up and you're ready for it. Somebody else might say it's grace from God. I don't know, but it's just you can set up conditions. What later on we're going to talk about as a wisdom environment. You can set up conditions for people, for someone to engage in restoring, but you can't force it. And that's the necessary first step. And that requires giving up control, right? Accepting. In Tai Chi we talk about yielding, giving in but not giving up. And you might know some of those other words that refer to the same idea. But it requires us to give up some control of that story. You know, that you can't keep saying that's my story and I'm sticking with it. Right? So now it might be possible. I don't want to jump ahead because that'll be more in the other part. But it might be possible to set up certain conditions that will allow or encourage or inspire somebody to to go this route. Maybe later on we can talk a little bit about the work that you're doing too, because those folks also have to say, you know, I'm in pain, I need to do something different here. And then it also has to do with, as you were saying before, what you call it. You know, like therapy, see you later. You know, I tell my students in gerontology they have to do an interview with an older adult in my introductory class. And I say, you probably don't want to tell them you're in a gerontology class, because it unfortunately still has this stereotypical association. So I say, just go and tell them that you're in a course that is asking people to talk about their lives.
Yeah.
And they love it. Everybody does it. So that's unfortunate, because we were saying in the car driving, I don't look quite a talk in a short time in the car. But it's paradoxical in a way, because gerontology has kind of carved out a specific body of knowledge or insights that we would say is somewhat different, but complementary to some of the traditional disciplines. So we sort of like that, you know, we want to identify it as something. But it has still a lot of the stereotypical associations with it. Anyway, so storytelling is the first one. And then the second one, reading the story, which one of my students last week said, well, I don't like the word reading. Maybe it's like reflecting on my story or thinking about my story, you know, instead of reading. So that's okay. But by the way, Bill Randall and Beth McKim, two of my colleagues, wrote a book called Reading Our Lives. I think it was 2008, Oxford University Press. And you cite them in your dissertation. So that's about, after that first step of being willing to entertain your story or look at it, then you can read it, look at it, reflect on it, with the idea that you can re-story and not only, as I said before, not only have a new story, but you know, narrative stuff's a little more demanding than that. It's really being a new story. So it's not just the ideas, like which may or may not work, right? Sometimes there are techniques with cognitive therapy or something where you kind of change the way you think about something and get some new ideas in there. But if it doesn't get a little deeper than that to your emotions and the meaning of that story for you, it may not work over the long term. So you may not be able to complete this restorying process. But that would be it. So, but I think we can do that. There are some folks who, in terms of aging gerontology, folks who say we're very continuous in our ways of being over the lifespan. That who we are early on is who we are going to be all our lives. And other people would say, well, we can be quite discontinuous. We can really change basic things about how we see the world or how we relate to an experience we've had earlier on. So there is that kind of debate. So it depends where you come down on that. I think sometimes trying to be the same as you were before doesn't work too well, because everything else around you has changed, and you're trying to stick with the story. Maybe you know people like that. They probably want to stick to the story, and you sort of say, well, everything's different. You know, now there are Apple computers, right? Yeah. We got to figure this out. And every time I do figure something out, I say, wow, does this ever make my life easier? Just coming out here, because I've only had my phone for 3 months now, and just coming out here, all the stuff I could do to connect with you and send a message to my wife who's in Toronto right now, and talk to Judith, my phone or messaging or emails and Skyping. And in the case of Apple iPhones, you can Skype on them too. It's really cheap. So there's all this stuff that every time I pick something up or get onto it, I say, this is great. So maybe not a fundamental restoring thing, but I tend to be very intimidated by stuff like that. So I'm usually pretty proud of myself when I can do it. Okay, so again, the idea is that the objective, I guess, of restoring is to try to change the meaning that the story has for us, or has had for us for a long time. Okay. Said about 2:15 they would probably bring the stuff in.
And we'll be seeing them come.
Yeah, that's probably going to be very good timing.
Okay.
Any questions, Doug? As I said, anytime you have anything you'd like to add or disagree with, we can.
Just very excited, kind of keen on your last one here, because you know, in the telling of the story, is it true, Gary, that change can start just writing it, change, like kind of bigger stuff, and reading it, and then now when you go to tell it, I want to hear what you talk about telling a story to another person or to a group of people, because that's, are you going to get into that?
They would, no. You could probably, you know more about it, but I know it's different.
Yeah.
But
okay, but the telling of it, is the telling really as important?
The telling, I mean,
yeah.
The point that I can address is, besides the fact that the different audience changes the way the story is told and listened to and how it comes out, but that first movement is very often changes take place without going any further than that, but just getting the story out. It's very healing. A priest friend of mine once told me, he said, you know, I don't do anything in the sacrament of confession or reconciliation. He said, I don't really do anything. All I do is listen to a story. The person's honest, they're willing to tell me the story, and they get healed by God or whatever you happen to believe in. But he said that's what it's about, is letting the story out. So, and that's actually a good point to raise, because that facticity jail thing I had there, the facticity has to do with living the story. You can't see it because you're living it. Right? And we're always doing that. Whatever story it happens to be, it's right there. So it's only when you can let it out and see what it is that you can progress to changing it. Another example of that first movement being okay, or being effective in itself, is a colleague of mine, a philosophy professor at St. Thomas. And he retired, and he was telling me, he said, I didn't know about us old folks, so I'll tell you this story. He said, you know, I'm 65 years old, I never had a panic attack in my life, and the day I retired, I started having panic attacks. So he said, what the hell? So he went to see this counselor, and she said, I want you to just take a copybook, a pad of paper or a copybook, and just write down anything you want about some of your life experiences. No agenda, really, just write it down. So he said he filled up this book, and he had another appointment with her after a couple of weeks, and he told me, he said, I never went back. He said, the panic attacks were gone, I was fine, that's it. So that's something to, I think that sometimes I talk to groups of professionals or students with different kinds of experience, or they've been on the receiving end of the atom bomb being thrown at a mosquito. Like, here's the drugs, go home and come back in a month. That sometimes that's not necessary. Sometimes it's that simple process like that will relieve the person of what the issue was that they were trying to deal with. Sometimes not, but sometimes yes.
Yeah, I love that idea. It reminds me of a lot of Jung's writings about how the dreams are stories of the unconscious, and even remembering them, the soul has a way of healing just through remembrance.
Yeah, that's a good. It made me think of Eckhart Tolle, and those of you who are familiar with him. If anybody not familiar with him, or okay, you've all heard. He lives out here, right? And he says, there are so many there are so many stories or things about us that we really don't need to look at. We really don't need to bother looking at. We can simply be with it in mindfulness or other kinds of practices. I'm going to talk a bit of something about that later on. But so yeah, sometimes just a simple intervention like that will work. Sometimes another one that seems to be, from talking to people, that often happens is someone may be going through a kind of spiritual transition. And there's a form of depression or loss or grief. We call it grief. But it's actually good. Eventually it's going to be good, but they're lost in the forest like Dante said for a while. So to over-treat that is actually blocking something good from happening to the person. And a lot of times I think we don't include that in the way that we work or try to be with other people in these kinds of settings. Yeah.
I was going to have a comment on that storytelling and that how we make contact with the story before we start the telling, how we recollect it. So and I'm thinking when we sit in a group and we try to verbally remember, to orally bring it out, versus if we've written, if there's a different kind of contact, and then some of the work we've done where there's been a photograph, and how contact with a story can be different depending on the way in which the modality. And you think about even just play therapy where you can manipulate something with your hands makes a different kind of contact in the story. But it's that first step.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I don't know a lot about the different modality. I've heard of them. In fact, I just read something on the plane where this professional presenter was saying that they're trying to make or encourage people to get away from PowerPoint slides with words on them. Want more pictures. And for that reason, that they're more, obviously I haven't got to that point, but they're more evocative and say different things than print does. So yeah, there could be different triggers, possible triggers. And in long-term care, the way that's sometimes done is with objects instead of, I have a story about that from my own experience. That I went to a nursing home a couple of years ago to give a talk to, I thought it was going to be staff. So I did something like this, with walking through. And when I got there, they said, "Oh, by the way, this is the residents are going to be at your session." So after about 5 minutes of extreme stress, I said, "Okay, let's see here, let's go." So we gathered together, and I started out actually with the apple exercise, which I was going to do anyway. And so we got to, I had a fourth one there, the dog. So, it was the cat. The cat was up there, and somebody told a cat story, and then this lady started talking about a dog. And another resident said, "He wants a cat story, not a dog story." So I said, "No, that's okay, we can talk about dogs too." Fish or anything. So it worked really well. We had a lot of laughs and it worked really well. And then when we came to another part about the storytelling and restoring, and I brought along this photo album that someone had given me, a 100-year-old lady in Winnipeg when I visited there, and she had a life story book. Which, by the way, there are some really interesting chapters in this Storing Later Life book using those kinds of interventions. So she gave me this, she wasn't at the workshop that I gave, but her daughter introduced me to her because her daughter was showing the book at the workshop. So I said, "Could I have a copy of that?" And so she gave it to me as a gift with personal photographs and memorabilia in the book that would trigger her, and she had dementia, to remember songs or see photographs of different things. So I switched from the print thing to this photograph book. And I just went around to each of the residents and opened the photograph up, and there was a wedding and pets and children and places, and it was marvelous. They just connected with that immediately. So I was really, dancing on my feet. But it worked out really well. And I learned a few things from that too. I mean, I knew not to discount what people can do regardless of where they're at in terms of cognitive functioning. I knew that, but I'm also not a professionally trained clinical person, so I learn as I go along with a lot of this stuff. Okay, the last little bit before we take a break, I find these helpful tools for listening to other people's stories and in kind of getting more detail with the life of story metaphor. So you may or may not find this useful. This is simply about applying pieces of the story terms to the metaphor. So these are some. We don't need one at a time. We can just sort of. So Bill Randall has another phrase called the it phenomenon. That after you start looking at life from this story perspective and familiar with the pieces of the metaphor, you sort of walk around listening to what people say from these points of view all the time. So people say things like this, right? I'm turning a new chapter, a new page, or chapter in my story. Or themes, I find themes very powerful. That listening to somebody's story, and what are the themes that they seem to find most meaningful? Whether it's a person or an event or something that's happened, something that they're very preoccupied with, and so that helps me to listen in a certain way, and I can say, well, without even saying it's, this is what you're thinking about, but to kind of talk to them, communicate with them, knowing that that is a significant theme in their life. I find that very helpful. And then, I guess the other part of it is, can I say something or do something to help them or not, whether it's a friend or not. I have a good friend, a newish friend in Fredericton who's a retired photographer and been divorced twice. And the second time he said, this was 10 years ago, second time he said, I'll use this language because he said, I just got the shit kicked out of me. Emotionally and financially. He had a big house, he had a BMW, all this stuff. Lost it all, and lost his job around the same time. So now he lives in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, 10 years later, and he's still very tentative. He has a real tough time with his life. And sometimes he gets a bit angry, even with me. He says, you have all this, you have all this, you have a wife, you have this. Well, sorry, but, I'm still your friend. And I try to, and my wife does too, we both know him, and we try to say, well, look, maybe you could try this, like, you're a wonderful photographer, you just freelance a little bit, you don't need to make a lot of money, but maybe you could make a little bit of money doing this or doing that. Or, get on the web, get on the internet, a respectable dating site, and do something. But he's just not there with it. So I don't know whether he'll ever, it's like he's completely exhausted by it and just doesn't have the confidence or, anyway.
I was just going to interrupt in that one. So is he telling himself a story that he's a no-good Nick, that keeps running around, or I know I'm unworthy, or I'm scared, or like, why don't you help him try to change his story?
Both my wife and I do.
I mean, you're not a therapist, you can get away with it. Both my wife and your goal, help him change his story.
Yeah, he's hearing about this you know, quite often, because that's what I do. So I talk about what I'm doing, and my wife tries. She's more assertive than me, and she'll say, "Look, you're a great guy. You know, you're really okay. You know." But he has to. He's just not ready to.
But may I ask, what would you say his story is currently running over and over?
Well, yeah, I think he's sort of burned out. That you know, I sort of can't come back from this. It's too much.
I'm less than.
Yeah. You know, I can't come back
I
from
can't
this.
come back. Okay.
No, I'm
No. Okay.
I've had one woman too many. You know,
He has a story.
Oh yeah, he has a story, definitely.
One woman too many.
Well, you know, one relationship.
Oh, I see. I didn't know there was a quantum.
I don't know.
Anyhow, that's
but that's, you know, this. So the themes that I can see very clearly the themes that he's
you see this.
trying to deal with, and it helps me to sort of try to communicate with him as a friend and help him out. But in his case, not much has happened so far. But, okay, then character, you get the idea of these pieces of the story. A plot, like Jerome Werner said, we have no drama in our life, no plot, then there's no story. So he would agree with his ontological metaphor that human, it's part of our nature. So you listen for the plot that the person is dealing with in the story as well, the action, or setting, narrative environment, or the setting of the story. I think there's hope for this guy because I say to him, you have really done some pretty impressive things here, because you've gone from living in a 5-room house with a BMW, and you're still alive, and you're sitting here talking to us. Sometimes you're laughing, and you've managed to do that. I don't know if I could do that. If it was all taken away from me overnight, I don't know. You should be, you know, proud of yourself or feel good about yourself that you were able to do this.
Gary, just a comment. Have you thought of giving him your sheet?
That's for after, but yeah. Okay, so setting, and the final one here is genre, and a term which I believe Bill's the wordsmith, by the way, so that's why I'm giving him credit for these words. I tend to write more ideas, and he loves to play with language. So in the stuff that we've written together, he says too much and I say too little. So we get together, and it's been quite a remarkable collaboration over 15 years that we haven't pissed each other off and left. Because we really have sometimes had to say, you know, I'm not going to write the book this way. It has to have less of this, or it has to have more of that. And we've managed to say, okay, let's meet in the middle somehow. But he's very much a wordsmith. And so genre, you know, the classic genre, tragedy, adventure, comedy, romance, Netflix, what else is there? And he came up with this term called regenerating the story. And what that refers to is that over time, or with help, we might be able to change the genre of that story. Sometimes it's over time. I know in the case of my divorce, which was almost 20 years ago, I would say it went from a tragedy, a year of being a zombie, to satire about Monty Python. And then in some parts of it, a comedy. Some things were just are now just funny. So that's another tool. Listen for the way people talk about different aspects of their life story. You can get a sense of where they might be at. My friend there is somewhere still between tragedy and satire. he's able to be sarcastic about it and in a kind of healthy way. But unfortunately, he's still tied to that awful thing that happened to him, and he can't quite get to the next genre of the story. That was
The question.
yeah. Question.
Can I just
Good.
ask a
Good.
question?
Good.
I'm still stuck on the comment you made about the it phenomenon.
Oh.
I didn't get it.
It's kind of like what I was saying earlier about karma or grace or chance. Like when you start to look at life as a story, when you see that you look at the people's lives as stories, as narratives, and so you're always looking for these things, chapters and themes and settings, characters in their stories. You listen to their stories from that point of view, perhaps even your own story.
Oh, so these are the it's.
Yeah.
Okay.
The it is the narrative metaphor itself with all these pieces in it.
Okay.
So it becomes a way of seeing things rather than just a sort of intellectual approach or a theory, more than a theory. And I have to say, I for years now, that is the way I listen to people.
Could you, are you going to do it in your presentation? Could you just illustrate very quickly with one of the people here? Like, are you saying that if we have someone that we want to work with, like, because these are all a lot of them are therapists, that how would you start with your clients? Say, in the back of your mind, I'm going to bring your story out, and I think, well, what are the chapters of this woman's life or man's life, or themes, or what the character or plot? Can you kind of illustrate how I could grasp that could be helpful for us? Did you plan that or not?
The little bit that we'll do with that is that that exercise that
Because I think there's when you put a narrative tool like this, I'd like to see it kind of in action.
Yeah.
So we could take it away and run with it.
Yeah. Now after the break we can do that. The way I usually do it, it can be a longer thing or a shorter thing. Probably today what we should do is give everybody a few minutes to work with it. Not now, but after the break, to work with it. And then, in my classes I don't make people say personally what they've written down there, because they might it might be too personal. But I just say, have you got some generic things that we could put up on the board, and I can give you some that are based on research too. So that would give you a little taste of it.
Because I just got a comment, like at a personal level, I don't know what the plot of my life is. I don't know what it is. Right? But I was thinking for my clients, it could be very helpful. This language, particularly the population we work with, like plot. Well, that would be that's an okay term, not too threatening. What are the themes of your life? You know. So anyhow, I'm glad we're going to do it.
Yeah. Just before I forget, there is a chapter in that book by Jerome Singer, and it's about couples therapy.
Yeah.
It's a narrative approach to couples therapy. So that's, and he does some different kind of thing, but which I believe is asking both. I haven't read it for a little while, but both parts of the couple to identify 10 sources of meaning or 10 stories or themes in their relationship or their lives. And he gets them to do it individually, and then he brings them together and uses it as a way for one part of the couple to perhaps understand more about the other couple. So he's an expert in that particular type of therapy.
Good. So if I interrupt, thank you. Gary, Catherine, is it tea here or coffee? Yep. And what do you reckon, a 10-minute break?
Whatever that is, at least 10-15 minutes.
I recommend that you get your tea or coffee and something to eat, and we don't wait very long to get back at this, because I think his next part is going to be kind of interactive, and 4 o'clock will come quickly.
Yeah, I'm sure if you want to stop a little bit before.
Yeah. So where do we get the drinks?
That's more studying.
That's find my piece of paper first. I don't have an overhead for this, but you have the handout. Let's just try this little exercise. It can be, like a number of things I'm sharing with you, it can be a longer process, right? If we had a whole day together, we could go into some of these exercises in more detail. There are also other exercises that we use in different settings. And I guess before I forget, at the end of the day, a couple of resources besides the book, besides that book. And I'm only flogging that book. You know, we don't make money from these books, right? We say we make coffee money, and it isn't lattes that I drink, it's Tim Hortons. So it's a resource that has kind of the history of of narrative gerontology by way of the references that you can find in there if you're looking for something specific about a particular topic area. As I say, they range very widely, some of which I should hope to have time to mention a few of them before we're finished. So this is one exercise. Sorry. So a place you can go for resources is called CIRN, Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Narrative, CIRN. That has a website, and that comes out of St. Thomas University. We have a center with a website. We also have a journal called Narrative Works, which is an online journal. You may be interested in looking at submitting something to that. Then there's within the CIRN, it does give you that information, but there's a conference that occurs every 2 years now called Narrative Matters. It's been held in Fredericton a couple of times where we live, Nova Scotia, Toronto, and this year, at the end of May, it's in Paris. Ryan Schiff. Have to go there, unfortunately. Ryan Schiff was a colleague of ours who just incidentally, if that's an area of interest, does narrative work with Holocaust survivors. And some of that's actually been done with Peter Sudfeld here at UBC. They published a special issue of the journal, International Journal of Aging and Human Development some years ago. And they had a narrative study of Holocaust survivors. So that's another kind of resource. Anyway, Narrative Matters every 2 years takes place in a different place. We don't usually know in advance. It could be in the Netherlands next, I think, after that. But anyway, unfortunately, I don't think you can't submit anything now to that. It's too late. And it was subscribed. They had room for 300 submissions, and they received 620 from all around the world. And that's not just gerontology. It's anybody who's interested in narrative. It's an absolutely fascinating conference. As you walk down the halls, all these people we don't have to explain anything to, and they just talk about their literary background, their clinical background, their theoretical background, historians, anybody, just about any walk of life that's interested in stories seems to show up there. And they usually say, I found somebody I can talk to. So you may want to keep an eye out for, or you might check if you can still register for it, but I believe it's full up, but you can check. So those are some resources. This little exercise, which I borrowed from my colleague Gary Rieker, who is retired now from Trent University, but still doing some research. He did a lot of work on the concept of personal meaning. I don't know if you've heard of him or familiar with him. Purpose in life, meaning. And he developed some scales about it, which we always debate, because I don't think you can get personal meaning out of scales myself. So we always have this debate over a beer, about whether you can do it or not. and not all black and white. And I borrowed this from him and changed it for my own purposes. So what I do here, as you can see, is you can walk yourself or others through the process. So you might just try it for a short version of it. The first thing you try to do is list things that make life meaningful for you. So usually say, what gets you up in the morning? What makes you feel like getting up in the morning? Well, that's the first step of it. If you're able to, you can try to rank them. Like, is there one that's really important and stands out above the others? Or perhaps not. But there might be something you can say clearly. Okay, so that's the second step in the process. Then you can think about have they changed over time? Once you kind of identify some of these sources of meaning, have they changed since earlier on in your life? And when I'm talking to 20-year-olds, I say, think about it, because some things, even at 20, might have changed since you were 15, something like that. And they usually do. They can usually say something about that. That's when Marv and I were talking about this gerontology thing, and that when I teach my intro class now, I always say gerontology is just about change across the lifespan. So try and think of changes in your own life that might not happen to an older adult, or might happen to an older adult, not to you, vice versa. And it's a way of, I think, of making students think less of the skull and crossbones, or the nearly dead syndrome of gerontology. Okay, and then you can also ask how the sources might change upon retirement. So, right away, to go back a second, sources of meaning can be themes, right? You could think of them as themes in the story. What's really meaningful? What are the central themes? So how they change, how they could change. And then the last part is, if you want to, you can think of new sources of meaning. What are new sources of meaning that you might add to your meaning constellation or set of themes? And not so much lately, they don't seem to have so much money anymore, but I used to give pre-retirement seminars to federal government employees. And they weren't too bad. They would have the usual health and pension advisor, but they would also invite the spouses for 2 days to join them, which was an important thing to do. And they would invite somebody like me to come in and talk about life a little bit, besides those other things, those other themes. So I used to walk them through this, and my wife was actually an inspiration for this, because she worked for the federal government for almost 20 years, hated every minute of it, but she used to say, what you have to do is go in there and tell them to think of themselves as 18 again. What things or themes or things that they always wanted to do. I suppose it's almost a cliche now, we talk about this bucket list thing, right? And some people resonate with that idea. But try to think of things that you always wanted to do, but you got a job and you had a family and all this other stuff, and now you might want to add that to a theme or a source of meaning. So that's kind of a way for people to think about that. Because as you probably all know, a lot of people don't, right? They don't think about these things very much. What do I do with all that time once I'm retired? Or what's my relationship going to be like with my spouse once I'm retired? There are lots of jokes about that. Right? Some are real jokes. I mean, a lady friend I drink coffee with in Fredericton, a bunch of us were sitting around, and one lady said to the other one, the first one was talking about her husband, and she said, why don't you trade him in or something, at your age, just trade him in and get a new one. And she said, I'm paraphrasing her, but she said, it doesn't matter because they all become a husband. So I thought, whoa, okay. That's her theme about that, or plot or whatever. Okay. Okay, so which sources you might add, which ones you might drop, source of meaning that you might be willing to drop from your set of meanings, or which ones could be made more or less important. So you can see the idea that, or can you see the idea that if somebody's working with their life story that they might be grieving over the loss of a very powerful source of meaning. So this sort of thing helps them to get the story out, right? To identify some themes, and then maybe to identify some other sources of meaning and think, well, maybe I could do more of this and less of that, or maybe I will be okay after a while without this source of meaning, but I can do something else. Yeah.
I was just reading in the book, they were talking about working with individuals with dementia.
Yeah.
And what you said about people just being stagnant in a certain period of their time, of their lifespan, and just working with that. Like if they're stuck in their teenage years, not trying to pull them back necessarily, but staying with that time.
Yeah. Can I save that for a few minutes? Because that's what we're going to get to in a minute. Right after the exercise. Ask it again if I don't exactly touch your point, and I think I will. So what would you like to, had an idea, if you had enough time to get a taste of the flavor of what it is, do you want to put a few things up on the board, or have people, have you sort of say a few of the things that you came up with? Is this okay to write? It is.
I have some markers as well.
Pardon? I had a guest speaker last week in my class, and he brought his own markers. And as soon as I saw him write the first word on the board, I said, oh no, the custodian's going to kill me. Because it wasn't a dry erase marker. I said, excuse me, can you?
Now pull it.
That's right.
Maybe we can use the end here.
Well, this is good. I think it works.
Let's just use the end because we'll be,
Okay.
basically we'll just be,
Okay.
it's not really vital to put it on the board, but just to have an idea. We're going to have it back down again.
Yeah.
Okay, don't worry.
Okay, we'll put it on the side here.
Yeah. Okay, so would somebody like to,
We'll start with the candidate tomorrow. That's great.
oh yeah.
Okay. Living my story, making my own myths about my life.
Making your own myth. Okay, so I'll throw a few names out here if I think of resources for you. Dan McAdams is a really good person to look at for, he's a narrative psychologist, lifespan narrative psychologist. He's done a lot of work. And he talks about myths, personal myths. He also talks a lot about, maybe giving away one of the things we'll put up here, but it's okay. He talks a lot about generativity, Erickson's kind of generativity. I have bones to pick with Erickson, by the way. I don't really, I like some of his stuff, I don't like other aspects of it, so we may not have time to get into that. Okay, other one. Oh, by saying Erickson, I didn't shut everybody down.
Okay, can you repeat the question or the,
or
the exercise?
What did you come up with as a central or important source of meaning for your life? Sorry? Relationship? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah?
Children.
Sorry?
Children.
Children or family? Family.
I was thinking stories, including books and movies.
Okay, so stories themselves. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good one to bring up because you can think about these sources There are big ones, and there's research like people like Gary Reeker have done, but there are also unique ones, like idiosyncratic sources of meaning where somebody says, oh, I collect such and such a thing. It's not just a hobby, it's what gets me up in the morning. Or a common one is gardening. And gardening is my source of meaning. It's a spiritual experience. It's not just a hobby. It's a really important part of my life. One of my friends in my Tai Chi class, one of my Tai Chi classes is a retired clinical psychologist. She raises dogs, caselins. And she's told me several times, she said, I grieve more when one of my dogs dies than any person I know. So for her, it's a real, it says a lot, right? You know, about that.
I think one bit up there is God.
God or
No, not or. God.
spirituality, or did you want to say God?
No, God.
Okay, God. Got it.
Yeah, that was too slippery for me.
Okay.
Adventure?
Adventure, yeah. Okay.
Work career.
Work and career, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Maybe a couple others.
Greater purpose? Greater purpose?
A greater purpose, yeah. Yeah, that, if we don't have some sense of that, we can suffer a crisis of meaninglessness, right?
Creativity,
Creativity, yeah. Yeah, in general.
open possibility, something like open possibility.
Yeah, creativity that kind of gets you out of yourself.
What, ending well?
Ah, that's a good one, eh? Ending well, so I won't say you're a Buddhist, but that's part of what Buddhism is about, right? Is doing the journey well now and ending it well, so you can have fun when you come back. Yeah.
Communication?
Yeah, and what with other
Yeah, well, just, it's a very big word, but it
being
encompasses.
able to
You
communicate.
get up in the morning so that you can communicate with them. Else you'll stay in bed and be by yourself, right?
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Good memories.
Good memories, yeah. Making good memories. Yeah, that's a good one too, especially sometimes when we become, if we become more frail as we get older, and those can become more important. Yeah, well, that's good. That's a good range. Some others that have been identified by people filling out surveys about this. One is, some people say life itself is a source of meaning, like something like probably this, getting up in the morning. And another is legacy, which I meant by generativity, leaving a legacy in the world. Another one that comes up is hedonism. You know, wine, women or men and song, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Some people have said that not the sex, drug, rock and roll so much, but the bon vivant, you know, the living a life of travel, maybe adventure, good food, good wine, some combination of these things. That when I first learned this, it made me think of a friend that I had for years, actually when I lived out west here in Banff and Vancouver. And I haven't seen him for years, but he's probably still like that. He lived this kind of life, hedonistic life. He could tell you, he was an expert on wine, expert on clothing. Like he'd go shopping a lot, and he would know all the best stuff to buy and the right stuff to buy, fashion-wise. So food and wine, travel. Remember when I went to Europe years ago, he'd say, I'm going between in Italy, in Switzerland, through Lucerne to Milan, through the mountains. And he'd say, now, if you're going that way, you have to sit on the left side of the train to get the best view. So he would know all this stuff that was really kind of Rick Steves with more detail. And that's how he lived. To my knowledge, he didn't have a family. He sometimes had girlfriends, but not for a long time. But this was his lifestyle, and it seemed to work for him all right. I don't know for sure. Anyway, so those are some other ones. Okay, before we move on, I just want to mention one of, since you're being autobiographical, one of my new sources of meaning, which I think is more than just a hobby now, is barista training. So I'm an apprentice barista in Fredericton, in this cafe where the owner has trained in Australia and Toronto and all over the place. So I'm in boot camp to learn how to be a barista. And it's really fun. It's really a totally different activity from being a professor. And they're both nice, but this is really great. So some of my friends said, what are you going to do when you retire? Become a barista? And I said, I don't know. I'll just do it for part-time, for fun, or help out somebody who owns a place for a few hours here and there. I don't know. But it's really quite fascinating. It's a hell of a lot more complicated than I ever thought. So of course, now I'm a pain in the butt to my friends, because when I say I'm going somewhere, I say, well, I got to find the cafes, the good cafes. And I already found one in Vancouver. Artigiana.
Yes.
Yeah, it was on, I have an app on my phone called Bean Hunter. And it's got some places and not other places, but it had that one on there, and it's near my hotel, so it was actually very good. Okay, so that's the idea of this, and you can go through these different steps to go deeper into it or broader into things. But I think it can be quite helpful to play with what your sources of meaning have been, are, and could be in the future. Part of the barista thing is actually the 18-year-old. I haven't wanted to do that since I was 18, but the attitude is that just kind of, again, I'm not telling you stuff for sharing it with you, but in your work with other people too, it's trying to get other people to play with the ideas and their desires or things they're attracted to without necessarily knowing what to do with it or how even they're going to get involved with it. I mean, I just happened to say to this person, I love good coffee, and maybe I could learn how to do that. And the owner of the cafe said, you're on. Next week you show up here. Okay. All right. So now what I want to do the next little bit is talk about a concept that we have come up with, me meaning a group of narrative gerontologists. I would say it's the three of us who edited this book, and a couple of other another Dutch colleague by the name of Thijs Tom. And that is the term narrative care. And I just want to walk you through a few concepts that we talk about with that and give you at least one example. So narrative care is basically care based on stories, right? Any kind of intervention or approach, practical approach that is based on stories. So it's quite broad. And narrative care is core care, and I think those of us who do this would agree with that listening to somebody's life story is as important as providing them with, Maslow's basic needs of food, shelter, self-esteem. Well, you're getting up into that there, but it's as important as that, because it can help someone to find meaning in whatever it is they're experiencing. Like Viktor Frankl and philosophers like Nietzsche say, human beings can put up with anything if they find some meaning in it. So that's the idea here, that it is core care along with whatever else you might be involved with, say, in long-term care, which is helping people with more basic needs as well. And it's more practical, too, because if you provide core care, there's more research being done now to show that if you listen to somebody's story in the right way, they'll feel better, they'll take less medication, staff time with the person can actually go down. It's low tech, it's cheap. So that's what we do when I talk to administrators too. It's low tech and it's cheap. They love that. Right? So narrative care is core care. If I'm going too fast, we can ask after. Then biographical encounter, narrative foreclosure. Narrative foreclosure is a term that just lost his first name. There's a chapter in this book by Mark Freeman, who is a psychologist in the States, very passionate about narrative. And the chapter here is called Narrative Foreclosure. And he wrote another book more recently called Hindsight, that I haven't read yet, but it sounds very fascinating. So narrative foreclosure is the phenomenon where people shut their story down. They don't seem to have a new story. Or you were saying perhaps dementia, but there could be other reasons that people just, maybe my friend at the cafe, he's stuck in that story and he's foreclosed his story, which is his doing, because he's breathing alive in the world with other people, with a physical environment. Everything's going on around him, but he's closed off his journey. He's making a decision to close off his journey. That's what narrative foreclosure is about. And narrative openness is the opposite, of course. So the trick is, how can we help other people to go more towards narrative openness rather than narrative foreclosure?
Just on that, as you said before, the narrative listening is low tech. Actually, to bring someone out of foreclosure, I think, is not a low tech concept, because there's listening and then there's listening.
Yeah. That's a good point. The distinction there is usually, buying machines or fancy computers or something like that, or paying another human being to listen. That's a lot cheaper than some of the other interventions that end up costing more if you don't do this sort of care. That's a good point. It's not a volunteer, it shouldn't be sort of a volunteer exercise without somebody providing career paths and professions for that. So that's narrative foreclosure. The Dutch Thijs Tromp and Ernst Ballmeyer, with 3 others of us, did a paper that is going to be, or has already been published, I think, in the Gerontologist, about narrative foreclosure. They're trying to develop an instrument that they can use to measure narrative foreclosure with groups of people. Again, I don't know how successful that will be, but they're finding it very fascinating to look at. And that paper actually won an award at the GSA last year. The only reason I mentioned that is not to blow our own horns, but the fact that a narrative, story-based paper gets published in the Gerontologist and wins the award is revolutionary. That whole paradigm has never broken through that wall before. So there does seem to be some really nice movement in the direction for those of us who are passionate about this stuff. Okay, so narrative foreclosure. Then a biographical encounter. We just use that term to talk about an intervention, really any kind of intervention, story to story, storyteller, story listener, is a biographical intervention, biographical encounter, an encounter of 2 stories. And so it's just a general term to call attention to that. And the last set of ideas or concepts here that overlap a little bit Before I can leave you with some examples, because I think you have the slide for it if we do run out of time, but I'll call attention to it. It's about wisdom environment. And wisdom environment has certain characteristics. First of all, it's about meaning. And trying to allow some of these overlap. Maybe I'll just put them up, because they do overlap. Meaning has to do with eliciting or encouraging the story or the themes to come from the other person. So as we know, that's not always easy, right? To listen for their story and minimize your version of their story somehow, right? That's not easy. And from what I understand, in the old days, you wouldn't even try to do that. You would just say, I'm the expert, you're the client, I tell you what your story's about, and I tell you what to do about it. So narrative doesn't work like that. Narrative, there's this co-authoring of a story where you try to really listen to the other person's story, so it's their story that comes out. You might not even like the story, or you may disagree with it, or find it, problematic for you. But from a narrative point of view, that's what has to happen, called non-judgmental acceptance of the story. And that leads to trusting and perhaps more narrative openness rather than narrative foreclosure. So it's about their meaning, the meaning of the story to them. I know with dementia survivors, years ago they used to do this reality therapy, right? That's got to be ethically the most objectionable approach to things from my point of view. No, it's Tuesday. No, it's Wednesday. It's January. No, it's March. Trying to bring the person into your story instead of their story. And as the Chinese philosopher a long time ago said, who knows who's in what story anyway? If we really look at it, is our story the story, or the best one, or the real one? You can really ask those questions. So it's where their story, like last week, I'm leading up to this, but I should start integrating now or I'll run out of time. I teach Tai Chi in several nursing homes in my area, and I call that narrative care. In at least two ways, it's narrative care. But just to give you a quick example, one of the participants last week, he said, "Oh, what date is it? My birthday's on January 28th. They're going to have a party for me," and it was in February. So I just said, I know this guy a little bit, so I said, "You mean you haven't had that party for you yet?" I said, "Because I think it was a few days ago. They didn't do the party for you?" And he said, "Oh, that's okay. They're going to plan it for later or something." So what I'm saying is he's trying to work with where he is, not to make him feel like, I forgot when my birthday was, or they did have the party and I don't remember. All these things that can trigger anxiety or make him feel bad about himself. So one of the things I have up here, to me this is an endless process. It's a narrative practice. It's an art form. You're always, the stories are always unique, specific to a particular time and place and person. And more so with people who have dementia, for example, they change really fast sometimes. And so one day they're there with it, the next day they're not, and the next day they do remember it from before. So you can't be condescending, you can't try to fool them, but you're also trying to be respectful and be with them when they might contradict themselves. So it's tricky. It's really, it's fascinating and a wonderful learning opportunity for myself too. I mean personally too. So it is a form of practice, and really we call it a biographical encounter, the storytelling, story listening by exchange. But the listening is probably the most important part of it. Being able to listen well to a person's story. I think the philosopher Gabriel Marcel said this well too. He said, he talks about presence, about being present to someone. And he said, we can feel whether somebody really is present to us and listening to us and trying to understand what we're saying, or if we're just something in passing, or they're distracted by stuff and not really paying attention to me right now, to my story. And I think maybe most of you have had the experience of seeing a doctor that's too busy. Excuse me, who are you talking about again? Okay, so those are some concepts, and what we're trying to encourage to bring out from the person is their own ordinary wisdom, which from a narrative point of view we would say everybody, we all have ordinary wisdom. We don't value it, and a lot of times when you use the term wisdom, I find with people, they say, oh, that's for, well, Bill and I call it saints and swamis. They say, oh, I'm not a wise person. That's for people who are like this or who are like that. So, but with a little bit of talking with them and listening to their stories again, like in guided autobiography, where people will talk about how they have found meaning in some kind of tragic event or loss or suffering, how they've come to find some meaning in that, and you say, well, look what you did there. Well, that was really wise, because nobody could tell you how to figure that out, really, but you did. So gradually they might come to value their own ordinary wisdom, but sometimes they don't think they have it at first. So we don't have a lot of time here, but Bill Randall and I also wrote a book called Ordinary Wisdom, with a lot more of this kind of talking about this sort of approach. And in there too, we did somewhat of a critique of the contemporary psychological assessments of wisdom, like Baltus and Ardelt, forget the other couple, I haven't looked at it for a while, but there's sort of a cognitive psychology rendering. You had some of that in your, you did a good literature review. This cognitive psychology version of wisdom, which some of us find a little too psychologized and reduced and almost elitist, especially Baltus, because he talks about, unfortunately he passed away, but he talks about somebody with high levels of formal education being a counselor, that, these kinds of qualification in order to be wise. And he sort of backs off on it some ways, but it's unfortunate that he does that, because that's not wisdom. That has a thousands of year old tradition, and there's a lot more going on than that. I actually told him that once, and I think it was here in Vancouver. It was at a conference anyway, because Michael Chandler knew him, and we were out for dinner with him one night. As a graduate student, I was trying to be respectful and scholarly, but he wasn't my supervisor, so you could say. I said, I'm a philosopher originally, and this wisdom has all kinds of other things in it. Spirituality dimension to it, and ethical dimensions to it, and so he said, oh yes, he said, we're true to cognitive psychology first and wisdom second. Okay, I can go back and tell that story in my philosophy of science class. Anyhow, it's good that they study this phenomenon, but actually, a a good falsifiable theory is a good theory anyway, from that point of view. Okay, so ordinary wisdom. And the last one here refers to a chapter, another chapter in the book, which is also, there's 6 or 7 chapters by Dutch people in there, practitioners and researchers. And when we first got the contract for the book, the reviewer said, what's with the Ernst Bollmeyer and all this Dutch mafia in your book? So we had to explain why, you know, that they're all there because they're new, they're innovative. We've been to the Netherlands, we've looked at what they do, and they're exciting, and they should be in the book, so that was okay. So they do happen to be, not that they're the only ones doing good things, but you know how these projects come together. You find people that you work well with that are doing what you would like them to do. So it doesn't mean there aren't others who are doing some things, some good things. But anyway, this psychologist who works at 2 nursing homes in The Hague brought us in to show us her programs, and one of them is in the, you may both be in here, but for sure one of them, she uses a memory book with pictures. And the asking the right questions refers to the way that she approaches dementia survivors by not asking any objective questions. There are no questions that require knowledge answers because they don't know the answer, they get upset. So, for example, there's a stove in there, and rather than say, did you have a stove like this? She will say, do you know, what is this? What is this? Or do you know what this is? And it doesn't matter what they say. Because whatever they say it is, they can tell a story about it. If it is a stove, then they might say, well, did your mother cook on this? You know, and they might say yes or no. But all the questions are about opinions and not about facts or knowledge. But you can read more about that in there, but it switches the whole thing so that nothing's threatening to the person, and whatever there is, whatever wisdom or ability to communicate that's in there, they will, first of all, there's a communication with the person listening to the story, right? They are doing something. They're engaged in a connection with a person, whether it's factual or not. So that's what asking the right questions is about. And so it's a specific program but can be applied to many other settings, right? Just before I sort of going to wrap things up a little bit, I said that this Tai Chi is like narrative care. In one way it's pretty straightforward in that I'm listening for their stories. So it's along the lines of what we're talking about here. So I don't. It's not a narrative intervention, right? Where I'm explicitly saying, "Here's an object. Tell me what that is." It's not that kind of intervention. But they come to the class. We have quiet music. I designed it as a seated program. We're all sitting down, and they do whatever they want. But by way of the week after week, I get to know some of them. So I'll remember something that they said or something about them, and I'll use it to make a joke or to make some kind of connection. So that isn't the primary role of it, but it does work that way. It happens to work that way. But the other part, and I think what I really think is very important, and some of you mentioned mindfulness, I call it the stillness in the story. I call it the stillness in the story. That our life stories, our lives and our life stories, you don't have the whole story if you're only talking about words or emotions, concepts, or what we call the thinking mind. There's something else about us, which I call silence or stillness, God if you want. It depends what tradition you come from. But I think that's part of our human nature, is to have that quiet center. In our culture, most people, as Eckhart Tolle and many other people are writing about these days, most people have no time for that. So if you talk to them about that stuff, they say, what a waste of time. But very slowly there seems to be more interest. There are even a few books out now trying to tell CEOs that they can do more with less. You know? That if you can not try to expend so much energy finding a new widget, but stay quiet for a while, you might get a better idea. The creative process, right? But in our culture still, it's kind of a tough sell in many circles. But I think it's there, and that's the other way that this works with, I do it with my students in class now because I teach a course called Aging and Tai Chi. So the whole semester, pretty well every class we do a little bit of Tai Chi stuff. And with the other classes, besides whatever they say or what I say or the music or movements they do or they don't do, it's the setting that's there. It's quiet, it's non-threatening, they feel they don't have to do anything, and they get quiet. They find that quiet center in themselves. And just most recently, so we call that another aspect of narrative therapy, or narrative intervention. The therapeutic recreation person who I work with and who hires me to teach these classes, last week we were in the dementia unit, which I only go to every few weeks, and we were talking about it after, and I said, well, they don't really often follow the movements and stuff. And she said, this happened twice, once when I was alone with them, and once the week she said, there are 5 or 6 of them, they all sat down for 15 minutes, and I could see their eyes and their faces just soften. And she said, that works. You want to come back here? So, and she said, I don't care what they do, they might do this or they might do that, but that works. Which also speaks to the fact that I firmly believe human beings, people with dementia, are still human beings emotionally and inside. So that needs to be really respected and communicated with, aside from all the other. So, some people say, how the hell can you ever do that with those people? People who have no sense of any of this. And I say, you have no idea. You have no idea how good it feels to walk out of there and to be there. So anyway, I've been writing more about this. It's in my chapter in that book, and I'm starting to sort of move towards a book about more of this aspect of things, which I firmly would argue that it is part of the narrative life is story metaphor. I can tell you a bunch of other stories about these wonderful people I work with, but I won't do that. These are just some examples that are in the book. Ernst Bollmeyer does a lot of work with narrative therapy with people with chronic depression, and he's had quite some success with groups of people using his particular type of intervention with stories. And I edited the chapter, but I haven't read it for a little while. So, but it's basically trying to help people start to emphasize, perhaps like my friend's example I gave you before, to start to emphasize the positive stories in their lives rather than the ongoing facticity of negative stories. Couples therapy I mentioned before, dementia, suffering itself is an interesting. There are many phenomena when we think about them that when they're looked at from a narrative point of view, they don't look like they did from the outside, so to speak. When you ask people, Helen Black is a colleague who wrote a book about suffering in later life. as you can imagine, a narrative study interviewing people about what they thought suffering was about. And she was so surprised with some of the findings that this one lady had terminal cancer, was in a hospice, but all the interviews she did with her, she was suffering. What she defined as suffering was a failed relationship way back in her life. So, yeah, but you have terminal cancer and some other things that happened to her. That's not what was meaningful for her, which is another kind of insight, or insight of all this stuff, like Sharon Kaufman said a long time ago, relatively long time ago, right, in gerontology, the ageless self. She said, when you want to find out about one aspect of somebody's story and its meaning, you have to look at the whole story. You have to look at the whole life in order to get a better understanding of specific things like depression or chronic pain or stroke or any other kind of problem. You can't focus too much on that. You don't get the answers that way. So that's what she would say, and I would agree with it. Trauma and Marv's work, which do you want to say anything about that before we go?
No, I just let you finish, and I can always talk about that later.
Okay.
Thanks for mentioning.
Okay, there is a chapter in this book by Peter Coleman and a couple of colleagues about war veterans, narrative intervention with war veterans. He might cite I think he cites your work, actually.
Check.
So he's been doing some work with that. And end-of-life issues, David Kuhl from has done work on that. There aren't a lot of narrative studies yet with end-of-life care, terminal illness, but they're very insightful. Once again, there's so many stereotypes about end-of-life. People won't want to talk about it. People are this, people are that, and when you look more closely at it, it's really all us in another phase of life, right? It might be hard to get your head around that when you think of it from the outside. Okay, I just have some things up here about the way things work, the way the journey works. Frailty, confusion, unknowing, growing from loss, both creating and discovering, which is about acceptance and creation. We can't control, we can't make things happen, we can't make a new story happen in our life. We have to be open to receiving, being receptive as well. And again, a number of writers these days are talking about maybe we should look at aging as a journey to more life rather than a journey of life. If we really take this idea of meaning from loss and suffering seriously. Again, a Buddhist would say that. They would say, well, this is a perfect opportunity. It's all right there. You're going to lose everything. So, that's a courageous way to think. I'm not quite sure I'm there yet with all that. But. Okay. The final thing is these two quotes that I really like. Anyone looking honestly at life will see that we live in a constant state of suspense and ambiguity. Our minds are perpetually shifting in and out of confusion and clarity. If only we were confused all the time, that would at least make for some kind of clarity. What's really baffling about life is that sometimes, despite all the confusion, we can also be really wise. That's Sogyal Rinpoche, Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And the last one, which is kind of a mouthful, but I think you have it, so if you want to, I think it's a mouthful anyway. I like it. A good life story. Soul respects another's failure to find perfection, their resistance to enlightenment, sheer ignorance of absolute truth, misguided attachments, and unrelenting meandering. Thomas Moore wrote that in, these are my friends. She just turned 100. Other one's 98, 96. And that's the other group. This guy's really fascinating. They actually don't know very much about him in the nursing home. He only speaks a few words. If you say hi to him, he'll say hi back and can move one hand and comes to every class. And he's a fascinating guy. sorry, I forgot something happened. Yeah, so Thomas More, I thought I had the title down. It's a little book called Meditations on the Monk Who Dwells in Daily Life. Those of you who don't know Thomas More, he was a monk for quite a long time, and then left and now has a family and writes and does workshops and stuff. So they're all aphorisms, very short pieces that are pretty powerful, pretty interesting. So we stop there?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Gary, and maybe, what time is it right now? Okay, we've got some time for questions and just general discussion, Gary, so we've been standing all the time. Want to sit down?
Sure.
Sit at the front there, call Cheryl, and maybe just hearing comments, or maybe Gary be interested in some of you using this particular approach in your work, so why don't you begin? Go ahead.
Or a critique, or what, anything at all.
Go ahead.
I'm really interested in using narrative in groups, and I was wondering, in the book they mentioned something with reminiscence as healing, and I know Dr. Russell, you've done a lot of work in Chile, and then Dr. McCormick does the native reconciliation. So this idea of narrative as almost mass mourning, and how that comes into play for both of you in the work.
Go ahead.
I don't do a lot of group work except through guided autobiography, and periodically I teach courses in that or give workshops. So that's not therapy, right? That's a therapeutic, but everyone's in total control of the stories and even the theme or the agenda that they talk about. However, in those groups, I've seen a lot of people make this movement from facticity to possibility with something in their story. And I think if the group's is successful and if it's set up, and people understand what's going on, we were saying earlier too, that there's a camaraderie that some groups will just be like best friends. Like they won't even say some of it to her. One lady told me she started the course by wanting to leave a legacy, her story, to her family, and it got so intimate with the group that she said, "I threw it in the garbage last night. I'm not telling them this stuff. This is for me." So a lot of things happen, but in the setting that I use, it's not a specific therapy theme or agenda.
Yeah. So just I would respond, Gary, and I talked about this. For those of you here that are working in a counseling or clinical psychotherapeutic context, we've extended their work from the narrative people to make it therapeutic. We don't apologize for that. We say that telling the story in and of itself is a therapeutic event, provided it's witnessed. So if it's witnessed by one of the